In a world where success is measured by designer clothes and city addresses, where social media followers matter more than character, and where your zip code determines your worth, one girl was about to shatter every assumption about what it means to be extraordinary. She walked into that room wearing hand-me-down boots and carrying the smell of fresh hay in her hair. The laughter started immediately. Whispers followed her every step. They saw a simple farm girl who didn't belong among the elite, the educated, the privileged. They saw someone to dismiss, to mock, to forget. They had no idea they were looking at someone who would soon make history. Sometimes the most powerful moments in life come not from those who expect greatness, but from those the world has written off. Sometimes courage doesn't wear a uniform or carry credentials. Sometimes it wears muddy boots and speaks with a country accent. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person everyone underestimates becomes the one who changes everything. This is the story of how one name, spoken by the most powerful man in the room, turned mockery into stunned silence and transformed a laughingstock into a legend. This is the story of how the girl everyone dismissed became the hero no one saw coming. The general knew something they didn't, he saw something they missed, and when he spoke her name, everything changed forever. Get ready to discover why sometimes the most extraordinary people come from the most ordinary places, and why the girl from the farm was exactly who the world needed, even when the world didn't know it yet. The morning mist still clung to the cornfields when Sarah Mae Thompson pulled on her only good dress, a faded blue cotton number that her grandmother had sewn 3 summers ago. The fabric was thin from countless washings, and there was a small mend near the left shoulder where she'd caught it on a fence post while chasing their escaped pig, Hamlet. But it was clean, pressed with care using the old iron heated on their wood stove, and it would have to do. Today was different from all the other days in her 17 years of life. Today, she was leaving Millbrook County for the first time ever. Standing in front of the cracked mirror in her tiny bedroom, Sarah Mae tried to tame her auburn hair into something resembling sophistication. The unruly curls seemed determined to escape any attempt at control, much like Sarah Mae herself had always been. Her hands shook slightly as she twisted the strands into a simple bun, securing it with bobby pins that had seen better decades. The scholarship letter lay on her dresser, creased from being read and reread countless times. The Department of Defense Advanced Student Initiative had somehow found her in this forgotten corner of rural Kentucky, a place where the nearest traffic light was 30 miles away, and the biggest excitement was usually the annual corn festival. Out of thousands of applicants nationwide, she had been selected as one of 50 students to present their research proposals to a panel of military officials, scientists, and government leaders in Washington, D.C. The irony wasn't lost on her. A girl who had never seen a building taller than the grain silo, who had learned calculus from library books because her school couldn't afford an advanced math teacher, who conducted science experiments in her father's barn using equipment she'd built from spare tractor parts, that girl was about to present groundbreaking research on renewable energy applications for military operations. Her father, James Thompson, knocked softly on her door. "Sarah Mae, honey, we need to get going if you're going to catch that bus." She opened the door to find him standing there, in his one good shirt, the same one he wore to church and funerals. His weathered hands held an old leather satchel that had belonged to his own father. "Thought you might could use this," he said, his voice gruff with emotion he was trying to hide. James Thompson was a man shaped by the soil and seasons, his 53 years marked by sunlines and calloused hands. He'd never finished high school himself. Had to drop out when his own father died to keep the farm running. But he'd always known his daughter was special. From the time she could walk, she'd been different. While other kids played with toys, Sarah Mae took apart broken radios to see how they worked. While her classmates struggled with homework, she devoured every book the tiny town library could get through interlibrary loans. "Thanks, Daddy," she whispered, taking the satchel. Inside, she carefully placed her research notes, printed on paper she'd bought with money earned from selling eggs at the farmer's market. Months of work, late nights by lamplight, calculations that filled notebook after notebook, all leading to this moment. Her mother, Mary Thompson, waited in the kitchen with a brown paper bag. "Sandwiches and some of them cookies you like?" she said, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Mary had cleaning houses in town to help save for Sarah Mae's college fund, working extra jobs even though her arthritis made every movement painful. She'd never said it aloud, but Sarah Mae knew her mother saw this opportunity as the answer to prayers whispered in the dark. The three of them drove in comfortable silence through the winding country roads towards Lexington, where Sarah Mae would catch the Greyhound bus to Washington. The old Ford pickup truck rattled and wheezed, but it carried them past fields where 3 generations of Thompsons had worked the land. past the small white church where Sarah May had been baptized, past the one-room schoolhouse where she'd started her education. At the bus station, her parents stood awkwardly, not quite knowing what to say. This was uncharted territory for all of them. No one in their family had ever ventured beyond the county lines for anything more significant than a medical appointment in Louisville. "You remember what you are," her father said finally, pulling her into a fierce hug. "Don't let nobody make you feel small. You've got more sense in your little finger than most folks got in their whole bodies." Her mother pressed a small object into her hand, a cross necklace that had belonged to Sarah May's great-grandmother. "For luck," she whispered, "though you won't need it. You got everything you need right here." She pointed to Sarah May's heart. "And here." She tapped her daughter's temple. The bus ride stretched for 8 hours, carrying Sarah May through landscapes that gradually changed from rolling hills to urban sprawl. She pressed her face to the window, watching cities grow larger and more imposing. By the time they reached the nation's capital, night had fallen, and the sight of the illuminated monuments and government buildings made her stomach flutter with a mixture of excitement and terror. The youth hostel where scholarship recipients were housed was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Glass and steel reached toward the sky, and the lobby alone was larger than her family's entire house. Other students moved through the space with casual confidence, their clothes obviously expensive, their luggage bearing designer labels. They spoke in voices that carried the polish of private schools and privilege. Sarah May's room assignment was shared with 2 other girls. Madison Richards came from Manhattan, her father a Wall Street executive, and she'd attended elite prep schools since kindergarten. Her suitcase held clothes that cost more than Sarah May's family made in a month. Jennifer Chang was from Silicon Valley, her parents both engineers at major tech companies, and she'd been programming computers since she was 8 years old in her family's high-tech home office. "So, where are you from?" Madison asked politely, though her eyes had already catalogued Sarah May's second-hand luggage and simple clothes. "Kentucky," Sarah May replied simply, unpacking her few belongings into the small dresser. "Oh, like Louisville," Jennifer chimed in. "I've heard that's a really cool city. No, Millbrook County. It's about 2 hours southeast of Louisville." The silence that followed was telling. Madison and Jennifer exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. "What's your research focus?" Madison asked, clearly trying to steer the conversation to safer ground. "Renewable energy applications for military operations, specifically focused on portable solar collection systems that can be deployed in field conditions," Sarah May answered. Another pause. Jennifer's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's ambitious. Where did you do your research?" "What lab?" "My daddy's barn, mostly," Sarah May said honestly. "And the old equipment shed behind our house." This time, the silence stretched uncomfortably long. She could practically see the thoughts forming behind their eyes. Barn, Kentucky, homemade equipment. The assumptions were writing themselves. The next morning brought the first day of presentations and workshops. Sarah May woke early, as she always did. Farm life had trained her body to rise before dawn regardless of circumstances. She dressed carefully in her one good dress and made her way to the hotel's breakfast area. The dining room buzzed with conversation, as 50 of the nation's brightest young minds gathered around tables loaded with food Sarah May had only seen in movies. Students clustered in groups, their easy familiarity with one another suggesting many had met at previous academic competitions or summer programs at prestigious universities. She stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling the weight of their difference. Their clothes, their confidence, their casual mentions of SAT tutors and college consultants. It all highlighted how far she was from her world of chicken coops and tobacco fields.
"You can sit here if you want," offered a voice beside her.
She turned to see David Chen, a quiet boy from Oregon whose research focused on atmospheric science. He seemed to understand something about not quite fitting in, though his clothes were clearly expensive and his accent spoke of good schools. "Thanks," she said gratefully, settling at the table. As breakfast progressed, conversations naturally turned to academic backgrounds. Students compared prep schools, summer programs at MIT and Stanford, research opportunities with Nobel laureates. When attention turned to Sarah May, she found herself explaining her unusual educational journey. "So you're completely self-taught in advanced mathematics?" asked Alex Morrison, a boy from Connecticut whose father was apparently some kind of important scientist. "Not completely. I had help from my teachers through 8th grade. After that, our school just didn't offer the classes I needed, so I used library books and online resources when we could get internet access." "Your school doesn't offer calculus or advanced physics?" The question came from Stephanie Walsh, daughter of a prominent surgeon from Chicago. Our school has 43 students in grades K through 12, Sarah May explained patiently. Our science teacher, Mrs. Henderson, also teaches English and history. She does her best, but there's only so much one person can cover. The table had grown quiet. Not the respectful quiet that accompanies admiration, but the uncomfortable quiet that comes when people realize they're hearing about a world completely foreign to their experience. But how did you develop your research proposal? David asked genuinely. I mean, without access to proper equipment or lab facilities? I built what I needed, Sarah May said simply. My daddy taught me that if you need something and can't afford to buy it, you figure out how to make it. I learned electronics from fixing our tractor's computer system and our ham radio. The solar collection prototypes are made from parts I ordered online, and some things I found at the junkyard over in Harrodsburg. The junkyard, Stephanie repeated slowly, as if testing how foreign the word felt in her mouth. Yes, ma'am. Amazing what people throw away. Found most of the metal components for my framework there, and Mr. Patterson, who runs it, taught me how to weld. The conversation moved on. But Sarah May was beginning to understand the challenge she faced. These weren't just smart kids from good schools. They were smart kids from a completely different universe. Their research had been conducted in university laboratories with equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. They'd been mentored by professors with international reputations. They spoke casually about opportunities that Sarah May hadn't even known existed. But as the day progressed through workshops and preliminary presentations, something interesting began to emerge. While her peers had impressive credentials and polished presentations, Sarah May's approach was fundamentally different. Where they had followed established research protocols and built upon existing work, she had innovated out of necessity. Where they had access to the finest equipment but used it conventionally, she had created novel solutions from limited resources. Her renewable energy research wasn't just theoretical, it was born from practical need. Their farm had struggled with inconsistent power, especially during storm seasons that knocked out lines for days. Her family couldn't afford a generator, so she'd begun experimenting with solar collection as a backup power source. What started as a way to keep the milk cold during power outages had evolved into a comprehensive system that could potentially revolutionize how military operations maintain power in remote locations. The preliminary presentations were held in small groups before expert panels. Sarah May watched as her fellow students delivered polished PowerPoints with professionally designed graphics and comprehensive datasets. Their confidence was evident in their posture, their clear diction, their familiarity with academic presentation protocols. When her turn came, she stood before the panel with her handwritten notes and hand-drawn diagrams. Her visual aids were photographs she'd taken with her family's old digital camera, showing her prototypes in various stages of development in the barn and equipment shed. Ms. Thompson, said Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, a materials scientist from MIT who served on the review panel. Your research proposal is quite interesting, but I'm curious about your testing methodology. How did you control for environmental variables without access to proper laboratory conditions? Well, ma'am, Sarah May began, her Kentucky accent more pronounced under stress. I figured that if these systems are going to be used in field conditions, they ought to be tested in field conditions. So I set them up in different locations around our farm. Some in full sun, some with partial shade from trees, some where they'd get hit with wind and weather. I monitored their performance through a full growing season, which gave me data on how they handle everything from spring storms to summer heat to fall temperature swings. Dr. Rogi, Harrison nodded slowly. That's actually quite innovative.
Most laboratory testing isolates individual variables, but you're testing total system performance under realistic conditions.
Yes, ma'am. See, if a soldier's going to be depending on the system to keep his communications running in Afghanistan or wherever, it's got to work when it's dusty and hot and maybe somebody's shooting at him.
Testing it in a clean lab might tell you how it works under perfect conditions, but perfect conditions don't exist in the real world. Something shifted in the room's energy. The panel members leaned forward slightly, suddenly more engaged. Tell us about this efficiency improvement you've documented, said Colonel Patricia Washington, the military liaison on the panel. Sarah May's nervousness began to fade as she moved into territory where her confidence was absolute. The main problem with portable solar systems is that they're designed for portability first and efficiency second. But I figured out that if you use a modular design with these folding reflector panels I developed, you can increase energy capture by about 40% without significantly increasing weight or setup time. 40%? Dr. Harrison's eyebrows rose. That's a substantial improvement. How did you verify those numbers? I built two identical systems, one standard design and one with my modifications. Ran them side by side for 6 months, measuring output every day. The numbers are consistent across all weather conditions. She pulled out a worn composition notebook filled with handwritten data tables. The panel members examined the meticulous daily recordings, noting the consistent methodology and careful documentation. "Miss Thompson," Colonel Washington said slowly, "are you telling me you developed this innovation working alone in your family's barn?" "No, ma'am, not alone. My daddy helped with the mechanical aspects, and Mr. Gordno Patterson at the junkyard taught me welding techniques. Henderson, my teacher, helped me work through some of the physics calculations, even though it was beyond what she normally teaches. And my mama kept me fed and made sure I got enough sleep." She paused. "I guess what I'm saying is, it takes a whole community to make something like this work." After her presentation, Sarah May walked back to her room feeling drained, but cautiously optimistic. The panel had seemed genuinely interested in her work, asking detailed technical questions that suggested they were taking her seriously despite her unconventional background. That evening, the scholarship recipients gathered in a large conference room for dinner and informal networking. The room buzzed with confident conversation as students discussed their presentations and speculated about the next day's final presentations to the full committee, which would include high-ranking military officials and government leaders. Sarah May found herself largely observing rather than participating. The other students moved through the room with practiced ease, introducing themselves to adults with titles like Deputy Undersecretary and Research Director. They spoke fluently about policy implications and funding opportunities, demonstrating a sophistication born from growing up around power and influence. She was standing near the window watching the lights of Washington spread out below when she overheard a conversation that made her stomach sink. "Did you see the girl from Kentucky?" Madison was saying to a small group near the dessert table. "She actually did her research in a barn. Like, an actual barn, with cows and everything. I heard she made her equipment from junkyard parts," added Alex Morrison. "How is that even considered real research? I mean, it's kind of admirable in a rustic way," Jennifer said with the tone of someone trying to be charitable. "But this is supposed to be a competition for serious academic work. Are we really supposed to compete against arts and crafts projects?" "She seems nice enough," offered David Chen, "but tomorrow we're presenting to actual generals and cabinet-level officials. This isn't a county science fair." Sarah May felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that her arts and crafts project represented months of rigorous work and had produced genuinely innovative results, but the confidence that had carried her through the day's presentation evaporated. Maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't belong here among these privileged, educated, properly prepared students. She slipped out of the room and made her way to the hostel's roof garden, a small space where she could be alone with her thoughts. The night air was cooler than the Kentucky evenings she was used to, and the city lights blocked out the stars that had always been her companions during late-night thinking sessions back home. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "How'd it go today, honey?" "Your mama and me are praying for you." She stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Good, Daddy. Presenting to the big group tomorrow." She couldn't bring herself to tell him about the other students' comments. Couldn't admit that she was beginning to think this whole thing had been a mistake. Her parents had sacrificed so much to get her here. Her mother had worked extra shifts cleaning houses. Her father had sold their only good piece of machinery to cover her travel expenses. Their faith in her felt like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. The next morning dawned grey and drizzly, matching Sarah May's mood as she prepared for the final presentations. The main conference room had been transformed into something resembling a formal government hearing, with a long table at the front, where intimidating-looking officials in military uniforms and business suits would sit in judgment. As students filtered in, Sarah May noticed they seemed to divide naturally into an inner circle of confidence and an outer ring of nervousness. She definitely belonged to the outer ring, but even there she felt like an outsider among outsiders. The presentations were scheduled in alphabetical order, which meant she would be among the last to present. She sat through presentation after presentation of sophisticated research, delivered with polished confidence. Each student seemed more impressive than the last, their work more complex, their conclusions more far-reaching. By the time her name was called, Sarah May felt completely outclassed. The panel at the front of the room included people whose names she recognized from news programs: senior military officials, deputy cabinet secretaries, research directors from organizations whose budgets exceeded her state's entire GDP. She walked to the front of the room carrying her composition notebook and her folder of photographs, acutely aware of how inadequate her materials seemed compared to the laser pointers and digital presentations that had preceded her. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice barely steady. My name is Sarah Mae Thompson, and I'm here to present my research on enhanced portable solar energy systems for military field operations. As she began to speak, something remarkable happened. The nervousness that had plagued her for 24 hours began to fade, replaced by the same focused intensity that had driven her through months of late-night experimentation in her family's barn. This was her work, born from her mind and shaped by her hands, and nobody in that room understood it better than she did. She talked about efficiency curves and modular design principles, about weight-to-output ratios and durability testing. She showed photographs of her prototypes functioning in mud and rain, explained how her folding reflector system could be deployed by a single soldier in under 3 minutes, documented the 40% efficiency improvement that had caught Dr. Harrison's attention the day before. Gradually, she became aware that the room had grown very quiet, the kind of focused attention that comes when people realize they're hearing something genuinely significant. Miss Thompson, interrupted General Marcus Rodriguez, a stern-faced man whose chest displayed an impressive collection of military decorations. Are you telling this committee that you developed these innovations working independently, without institutional support or advanced laboratory facilities? Yes, sir. Though I want to emphasize that I wasn't completely on my own. My community supported me in every way they could. And your testing methodology? You said you conducted field trials over 6 months?
Yes, sir.
Through a complete seasonal cycle, in various weather conditions, with daily data collection and weekly comprehensive analysis. General Rodriguez leaned forward. Ms. Thompson, are you aware that the Department of Defense has been struggling with exactly this problem, power generation for forward operating bases, for over a decade?
No, sir, I wasn't aware of that specifically.
I just knew that folks in remote areas often have trouble keeping reliable power, and I figured soldiers probably face similar challenges.
Indeed they do.
He paused, glancing at his colleagues. Your 40% efficiency improvement. Are you confident in those numbers? Yes, sir. I can provide all my data for verification. Another officer, Colonel Patricia Washington from the previous day's panel, spoke up. Miss Thompson, if your system performs as you've documented, it could potentially save lives in the field. Reliable power means reliable communications, which means soldiers can call for support when they need it. Sarah Mae felt a chill of responsibility settle over her. She'd been focused on solving a technical problem, driven by curiosity and the challenge of innovation. She hadn't fully considered that her work might literally be a matter of life and death for people serving their country. Yes, ma'am, she said quietly. That's something I'd be honored to contribute to. The questions continued for nearly 30 minutes, far longer than any other presentation had received. The panel delved into technical details, asked about manufacturing scalability, explored potential applications beyond military use. Finally, General Rodriguez raised a hand for silence. Ms. Thompson, thank you for your presentation. You may take your seat. As she gathered her materials and returned to her chair, Sarah Mae was vaguely aware of scattered applause, but her mind was reeling from the intensity of the questioning. Had she done well? Had she embarrassed herself? The panel members were conferring in low voices, their expressions unreadable. The final presentations concluded, and participants were dismissed for lunch while the committee deliberated. Sarah Mae found herself walking alone through the halls of the conference center, her mind replaying every moment of her presentation, every question, every nuance of expression on the panel members' faces. She was heading toward the cafeteria when she heard her name called from behind. Turning, she saw Dr. Elizabeth Harrison approaching with quick steps.
Miss Thompson, do you have a moment?
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Harrison studied her with an expression that was hard to read.
I've been thinking about your presentation all morning. What you've accomplished, working independently with limited resources, it's quite remarkable. Thank you, Mum. I'm curious about something, though. You mentioned that you weren't aware of the military's specific challenges with field power generation. What originally motivated your research? Sarah Mae smiled for the first time all day. Storm season 2 years ago. We lost power for 8 days after a tornado came through. Lost a whole week's worth of milk because we couldn't keep the cooling tanks running. Daddy was talking about maybe having to sell some cattle because we couldn't afford a generator big enough to handle the farm's needs. That's when I started thinking about solar backup systems. So this research grew out of a personal problem you needed to solve? Yes, Mum. I got interested in the technical challenges for their own sake, but originally it was just about keeping our milk cold during power outages. Dr. Harrison nodded slowly. Innovation often comes from exactly that kind of necessity. Some of history's most important breakthroughs happened because someone needed to solve a problem that was right in front of them. As they talked, Sarah May began to relax for the first time since arriving in Washington. Dr. Harrison asked about her plans for college, her long-term goals, her thoughts on continuing her research. The conversation felt natural, like discussions she'd had with Mrs. Tinger Henderson back home when working through particularly challenging concepts. Dr. Harrison, Sarah May said as their conversation wound down. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think I belong here? I mean, the other students have had opportunities I can't even imagine. They've worked in real laboratories with equipment I've only read about. They speak this language of academic conferences and research protocols that I'm just learning. Sometimes I wonder if maybe I'm just a curiosity. The girl from the farm who built something interesting in her barn. Dr. Biskin's travel.
Harrison was quiet for a long moment, considering her response carefully.
Miss Thompson, I've spent 23 years in academic research.
I've seen thousands of students, worked with some of the most brilliant minds in the world. What I've learned is that innovation doesn't come from having the best equipment or the most prestigious education. Innovation comes from seeing problems differently, from being willing to try approaches that others might dismiss, from having the persistence to keep working when conventional wisdom says something isn't possible. She paused, looking directly into Sarah May's eyes. Your peers had access to excellent laboratories and sophisticated equipment. You had a barn and a junkyard. They followed established protocols and built incrementally on existing research. You identified a problem and created something genuinely new to solve it. Which approach do you think demonstrates more actual innovation? Before Sarah May could answer, the lunch period was called to an end and participants were summoned back to the main conference room for the committee's announcements. The atmosphere in the room was electric with nervous tension as General Rodriguez stood to address the assembled students. Sarah May's heart pounded so loudly she was sure people nearby could hear it. Ladies and gentlemen, the General began, this committee has been genuinely impressed by the quality of research presented today. Each of you represents the best of your institutions and regions, and you should all be proud of your achievements. Sarah May felt the familiar sinking feeling that preceded polite rejection. However, General Rodriguez continued, this program was designed to identify not just excellent students, but innovative thinkers whose work might contribute meaningfully to national security challenges. With that criteria in mind, the committee has selected 5 students for advanced fellowship opportunities. He began reading names, each announcement followed by applause and excited congratulations. Sarah May recognized the names. All students from the inner circle of confidence, all representing prestigious institutions and impressive academic pedigrees. As the 5th name was read, Sarah May began to accept that her weekend in Washington had been an amazing experience, but not a life-changing one. She would return to Kentucky, finish high school, hopefully earn enough scholarship money for college, and continue her education through more conventional channels. In addition, General Rodriguez said, and something in his tone made the room fall completely silent, the committee has decided to offer a special research fellowship to one student whose work demonstrates exceptional innovation and practical application. Sarah May's attention snapped back to full focus. This fellowship will provide full funding for undergraduate and graduate education, access to advanced laboratory facilities, and direct mentorship from senior researchers in the field. More importantly, it will offer the opportunity to continue developing work that we believe has immediate applications for improving the effectiveness and safety of our military operations. The room seemed to hold its breath. This special fellowship is being offered to Miss Sarah May Thompson of Millbrook County, Kentucky. For a moment, Sarah May was sure she had misheard. The words didn't make sense. She became aware that people were turning to look at her, that someone was applauding, that General Rodriguez was speaking again, but his words seemed to come from very far away. Miss Thompson, would you please come forward? Somehow her legs carried her to the front of the room. Somehow she found herself standing before the panel of military officials and government leaders, all of whom were looking at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Miss Thompson, General Rodriguez said, your research represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking our military needs. But more than that, your approach, identifying a real-world problem and developing practical solutions with limited resources, demonstrates the kind of adaptability and creativity that makes someone truly valuable in critical situations. He paused, scanning the room. Young people, I want you to understand something important. The challenges facing our nation won't be solved by following conventional approaches or relying on expensive equipment and traditional protocols. They'll be solved by minds that can see problems differently, that can innovate under pressure, that can create solutions from whatever resources are available. His gaze settled back on Sarah May. Miss Thompson, your work in that barn in Kentucky may very well contribute to saving lives on battlefields around the world. That's not something that happens every day in academic research, regardless of how sophisticated the laboratory. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. There were forms to sign, contact information to exchange, discussions about next steps and timeline. Sarah May found herself surrounded by students who had ignored or mocked her just hours earlier, all suddenly eager to congratulate her and suggest they should stay in touch. But the moment that stayed with her came as the event was concluding. Doctor. Harrison approached one more time, extending her hand for a formal shake. Miss Thompson, I meant what I said earlier about innovation coming from seeing problems differently. What happened here today that didn't happen because you got lucky or because the committee was making a political statement. It happened because you did something genuinely remarkable, and you did it by being exactly who you are. She paused, smiling. Don't let anyone convince you that your background is something to overcome. Your background is precisely what enabled you to see solutions that others missed. The barn, the junkyard, the necessity of making do with what you had. That wasn't a limitation. That was your laboratory. That evening, Sarah May sat in her room at the youth hostel, finally alone with the magnitude of what had happened. Her phone had been ringing constantly. Her parents, Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Joe, Patterson from the junkyard, neighbors who had somehow already heard the news through the small-town communication network that moved faster than any internet. But for now she just sat quietly, looking out at the lights of Washington, D.C., trying to process the fact that her life had just changed completely and forever. Tomorrow she would fly back to Kentucky. Her first airplane ride, another scholarship-funded first experience. She would return to the farm, to the barn where her research had begun, to the community that had supported her in ways she was only beginning to understand. But she was returning as someone different, not because winning the fellowship had changed her essential nature, but because the experience had helped her understand what her essential nature actually was. She wasn't a farm girl trying to become something else. She was an innovator who happened to come from a farm, and that origin wasn't something to overcome. It was something that had made her uniquely capable of seeing solutions that others had missed. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah May's last conscious thought was of tomorrow morning's return to Millbrook County, where her parents would be waiting at the small regional airport, where Mrs. Henderson would want to hear every detail of her presentations, where Mr. Patterson would probably have some new piece of junk that might be perfect for her next project. She was going home. But home, she now understood, wasn't a limitation. Home was where innovation happened, when necessity met creativity, where impossible problems got solved because someone simply decided they needed solving, where a girl with hand-me-down clothes and second-hand dreams could become exactly who she was meant to be. The girl everyone had laughed at was going home as a fellowship recipient whose research might save lives and change military operations around the world. And the general had spoken her name not despite where she came from, but because of it.